Blood pools beneath the altar of Serapis, dark and viscous against white stone, that has witnessed 1,000 sacrifices, but never one like this. Tiles, oyster shells, shards of pottery, they tear into flesh that moments ago wore the dignified robes of philosophy. The mob's hands are everywhere, ripping, pulling, dragging her broken body through streets that reek of fish oil and human sweat. Hypatia of Alexandria, mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, dies not in quiet contemplation, but in shrieking agony. Her teachings scattered like the fragments of her skin across the city's stones. This is March, 415 AD. The greatest mind of the Roman world bleeds out in a church. Her crime? She dared to think, to teach, to stand between men who claim to speak for God and men who claim to rule by divine right. In a city where papyrus scrolls still smell of ancient ink and the library's ghost haunts every corner, knowledge has become heresy, wisdom a death sentence. They will say she seduced the prefect with pagan sorcery. They will say she blocked the path to Christian unity. They will say many things to justify what happens in the shadow of Bishop Cyril's silent approval. But what they will never say is the truth, that she was dangerous not for what she believed, but for what she knew. And in Alexandria, where faith and power dance their fatal waltz, knowing too much is the deadliest sin of all. Alexandria breathes philosophy, the way other cities breathe sea air. The year is 400 AD, and the city gleams like a jewel in Rome's tarnishing crown. In the museum, that ancient temple of learning, scrolls whisper against each other in languages the new god's followers cannot read. Greek geometry mingles with Egyptian astronomy. Persian mathematics dances with Jewish mysticism. The marble halls smell of ink and ambition, of cedar oil, preserving precious knowledge, of the particular mustiness that clings to parchment older than empires. Here, in rooms where Euclid once proved his theorems, Hypatia teaches. She is perhaps 40 years old, though age sits lightly on her sharp features. Her father, Theon, was the museum's last great mathematician. He raised her not as ornament, but as heir to centuries of intellectual tradition. Now she stands before Rome's brand is Hypatia's true heresy. She makes knowledge matter more than faith. Outside these walls, Alexandria ferments with different passions. The Christian bishop Cyril paces his episcopal palace, where incense cannot quite mask the smell of political calculation. He is nephew to the previous bishop, Theophilus, the man who led mobs to destroy the last remnants of the great library, who turned the Serapeum into rubble and Christian triumph. Cyril inherited not just his uncle's seat, but his appetite for absolute control. He stares across the harbor, where 300 ships bob like prayer beads, their holds full of Egyptian grain that feeds Constantinople. Whoever controls Alexandria controls the empire's bread. Whoever controls the church controls Alexandria's soul. But the city's mind, that belongs to a woman who refuses to kneel. The prefect, Orestes, represents the emperor's authority, a delicate counterweight to episcopal power. He is Roman, educated, pragmatic, and he consults Hypatia publicly, regularly. In his palace overlooking the harbor, where purple-dyed curtains filter the Mediterranean sun into royal shadows, they discuss civic matters, astronomy, the philosophy of governance itself. Servants whisper, bishops scowl. In the streets, Cyril's parabolani, those reckless ones, nominally hospital attendants but truly his personal militia, mutter about pagan witchcraft and unnatural influence. The city's Jewish quarter pulses with its own tensions. 20 years of Christian dominance have turned ancient synagogues into churches, transformed Hebrew prayer into Christian hymns. When violence flares, a theatrical riot, some say orchestrated, Orestes punishes Cyril's supporters. Cyril retaliates by expelling every Jew from Alexandria. Millennia of presence erased in a night of screaming and fire. Orestes complains to Constantinople. Cyril preaches about Christian unity. Between them, Hypatia continues to teach, apparently untouchable in her sphere of pure intellect. But purity is an illusion in a city where sewers run with political blood. In the museum's shadowed corridors, where oil lamps cast geometries of their own, she must sense the gathering storm. Perhaps she notices how some students stop attending, their fathers forbidding association with pagan. Outside, in streets that smell of rotting fish and rising fanaticism, men sharpen more than their arguments. The betrayal begins not with violence, but with silence. Lent, 415 AD. The city prostrates itself in penitential fervor, but the fasting feels less like spiritual discipline and more like the held breath before a storm breaks. In churches draped with unbleached linen, Cyril's priests preach sermons that circle Hypatia's name like vultures spiraling toward carrion. They never speak it directly. That would be too crude, too actionable. Instead, they speak of certain persons who lead the faithful astray, of female sorcerers who bewitch magistrates with unnatural learning, of obstacles to Christian harmony that must be removed. The words hang in incense-thick air, and the congregation understands. Peter the reader hears them. He is Cyril's man, not ordained clergy, but something more useful. A lector who moves through the city's ecclesiastical underworld with the bishop's unspoken blessing. His hands, which turn the pages of scripture with reverent care, can also turn a mob's rage from simmer to boil. In taverns near the docks, where wine is cheap and resentment cheaper, he speaks to the parabalani. The prefect mocks our bishop, he murmurs, his voice barely audible above the slap of waves against rotting pilings. He takes counsel from a pagan witch, while true Christians starve for justice. The parabalani listen. These are not theologians, but street fighters sanctified by ecclesiastical employment, former sailors, day laborers, men who know Alexandria's alleys as intimately as its sewers. They wear simple tunics, but carry an authority that makes city watchmen step aside. When they move through crowds, violence follows like a shadow. She holds him in thrall, Peter continues. With what? Philosophy? He spits the word. No, with older arts, darker knowledge, the kind that damned Jezebel and damns any woman who forgets her place. In the prefect's palace, Orestes senses the noose tightening, but cannot see who holds the rope. Letters to Constantinople go unanswered. The imperial court has larger concerns than theological disputes in a grain province. Attempted reconciliation with Cyril fails. The bishop, important lesson. Her voice remains steady, but her hands, those hands that have calculated the density of the heavens, tremble slightly as she rolls a scroll. That some truths are worth dying for. This isn't philosophy, this is politics. In Alexandria, they have always been the same thing. She leaves the palace in late afternoon, when shadows stretch long and the air tastes of salt and gathering darkness. Her carriage, a simple affair, no guards, no ostentation, rattles through streets that seem emptier than usual. Windows shutter as she passes. Merchants who once greeted her studiously examine their wares. In doorways, men in the parabolani's distinctive tunics watch, with the patience of predators who know their prey's habits. In the museum that evening, she teaches her last lesson. The subject is astronomical instruments, the astrolabe, that elegant marriage of mathematics and brass that can capture the heavens in human hands. Her students are fewer now, only the most devoted or most reckless. They gather close as she demonstrates how the rotating plates model the celestial sphere, how calculation transforms mystery into knowledge. Understanding requires courage, she tells them, and perhaps she is no longer speaking only of astronomy. The courage to question what you have been told, the courage to follow logic wherever it leads, even into darkness, especially into darkness. A student, barely 16, the son of a Christian merchant, raises his hand. Teacher, they say you practice magic, that your learning comes from demons. The room falls silent. Oil lamps gutter in the draught, sending shadows dancing across star charts and geometric proofs. I practice mathematics, Hypatia replies quietly. If that is magic, then the universe itself is sorcery. If knowledge is demonic, then God is the first heretic. She pauses, and something shifts in her expression. A recognition, perhaps, of how these words will be remembered. I teach you to think. In some ages, that is the greatest crime of all. The lesson ends. Students file out into darkness that seems thicker than mere absence of light. Some will never return. Some will deny they were ever here. One or two will remember this night for the rest of their lives and teach their own children that once, in Alexandria, a woman stood against streets toward the museum, wheels clattering against cobblestones still damp with night dew. The driver, an elderly servant who has driven her father, who drove her as a child, hums a tuneless melody, unaware that they traverse not merely Alexandria's avenues, but the final moments before history fractures. They turn onto a narrow street near the Caesareum church. The buildings here lean close, creating a canyon of shadow even at mid-morning. The driver notices the crowd too late. Men pour from doorways like poisoned water from a broken cistern. 50 of them, perhaps more, the Parabolani, their faces transformed by collective fury into something less than human, something ancient and terrible. They carry not swords, but civilian weapons, roof tiles, pottery shards, oyster shells from the harbor's refuse heaps, tools of humiliation, not war. The driver screams, tries to whip the horses forward, but hands seize the bridles. The carriage lurches, tilts. Hypatia grips the wooden frame, her scrolls spilling across the floor. Mathematics and astronomy scattering like autumn leaves before a storm. Peter the reader stands at the mob's center, his reader's robes incongruous against the violence he orchestrates. "The witch!" he shouts, and the word echoes off stone walls, multiplies, becomes a chant. "The sorceress who poisons our prefect's mind!" They drag her from the carriage. Her dignity shatters like dropped glass. Hands rip at her philosopher's robes, those simple garments that marked her devotion to intellect over ornament. The fabric tears with sounds like small screams. They strip her in the street, reducing the city's greatest mind to naked vulnerability, to female flesh that can be violated, controlled, destroyed. She does not beg. Perhaps pride prevents it, perhaps shock, or perhaps she understands with terrible clarity that words, her greatest weapon, mean nothing to men who have abandoned language for bloodlust. They drag her toward the Caesareum, once a temple to the divine emperors, now a church where Christ's mercy is preached over the bones of pagan grandeur. Her skin scrapes against stone. Knees that knelt only before knowledge now bloody themselves on steps slick with fish oil and human contempt. Inside, the church smells of stale incense, and against flesh is a blow against learning itself, against the dangerous idea that women might think, might teach, might stand equal to men in the realm of pure intellect. Blood pools in the church's carved channels, conduits designed to drain sacrificial wine, now serving a darker purpose. The marble, imported at staggering expense to glorify both empire and God, drinks deeply of philosophy's end. When the body finally stops moving, when the screaming fades to wet silence, they dismember what remains. Arms that gestured to the heavens, severed. Hands that calculated planetary orbits, separated from wrists. The head that contained perhaps the finest mathematical mind of the age, torn from shoulders still draped in torn flesh. The pieces. She is no longer a person, but pieces, are dragged to Cineron, a place beyond the city walls where criminals burn. The mob builds a pyre with the casual efficiency of men performing routine maintenance. Wood stacked, oil poured, fire set. Hypatia of Alexandria burns. The smoke rises black and greasy, carrying the stench of consumed genius across a city that turns its face away. In the prefect's palace, Orestes receives word and vomits into a bronze basin, the taste of bile mixing with political impotence. In the museum, her students huddle silent among scrolls that suddenly seem fragile as moth wings. In his episcopal palace, Cyril maintains his scheduled fast, eats no meat, and offers no comment. In Rome, when news eventually arrives, there is scandal. Quiet, carefully managed scandal. The emperor issues no edict. The Patriarch of Constantinople writes letters expressing vague concern. Peter the Reader is briefly exiled, then quietly returns. No one is ever formally punished for the greatest mind's most savage murder. Alexandria's streets clean themselves with spring rains. Blood washes away. The carriage, stripped of valuables, rots in an alley where stray dogs gnaw its wooden wheels. The museum remains, but emptier now. Students whose families forbid pagan association. Scholars who recognize a warning written in dismembered flesh. In the Caesareum church, the marble is scrubbed clean. Incense burned to mask the copper tang of spilled genius. Services continue. Prayers rise to rafters, acquired a new, terrible meaning. That one can die not for faith, but for its opposite, for the crime of believing that reason might matter more than revelation. The city breathes differently now. Philosophy's ghost haunts the museum's empty halls. In taverns, men speak carefully, aware that certain questions invite certain answers. Women who might have studied now marry young, their minds turned to household management rather than celestial mechanics. Alexandria, that great fusion of Greek thought and Egyptian wisdom, that jewel of learning in a darkening world, has learned its lesson. Knowledge without power is vulnerability. Wisdom without protection is a death sentence. And a woman who teaches men risks not merely disapproval, but dismemberment. The lighthouse still sweeps its beam across the harbor, but it illuminates a diminished city, a place where the question why has become dangerous, where curiosity courts catastrophe. In her last moments, as tiles tore and shells scraped, did Hypatia understand? Did she grasp that her murder was not personal, but symbolic? The violent birth of a new age where faith trumps reason, where orthodoxy matters more than truth, where asking questions is heresy. Or did she, perhaps, in that final agony, find a terrible vindication? She had calculated the movements of the heavens. She had proven theorems that would survive centuries. She had taught that truth matters more than comfort. And in her savage end, she proved one final theorem, that civilization is always one mob away from barbarity, that enlightenment is temporary, fragile, dependent on the courage of those willing to stand between ignorance and knowledge, even when that courage costs everything. The silence after violence is its own kind of sound. In the decades following, historians write carefully. Socrates Scholasticus, chronicling the church's triumph, mentions the murder briefly. A deed that brought no small disgrace upon Cyril and the Alexandrian church. He does not elaborate. Damascius, a pagan philosopher writing a century later, calls her a woman who devoted herself to teaching and describes her death with bitter precision. But even he cannot, or will not, answer the question that haunts the narrative. Why? Not why the mob killed her. Mobs need little reason beyond permission and fury. Not why Christianity's future. His letters are copied, preserved, venerated. History records his triumphs. It whispers his crimes. The museum closes within a generation. Some texts survive, carried to Baghdad, preserved in Constantinople, eventually returning to Europe through Arabic translations. Hypatia's own works vanish almost entirely. We have titles, references, fragments quoted by others, but her voice, that voice that explained the cosmos with mathematical precision, is lost. Perhaps that was always the intention. Perhaps the tiles and shells were meant not just to end a life, but to erase a possibility. The possibility that women might think, that pagans might persist, that in a world increasingly divided by doctrine, reason might still matter. Alexandria endures but diminished. The Arabs conquer it in 641 AD. The great lighthouse crumbles in earthquakes. The harbor silts. The city that once drew scholars from every corner of the known world becomes a provincial town, trading on ancient glories it can no longer claim. And in churches built on pagan temples, in universities that teach Aristotle through Arab lenses, in every place where women are told their minds cannot grasp complexity, Hypatia's ghost whispers its unanswered question. What might have been? What knowledge died with her? What discoveries were never made? Because the students she might have taught learned instead to fear curiosity. What different future might have unfolded if that March morning the carriage had taken a different street? History gives us facts, a date, a location, a method of execution. But it cannot tell us whether her murder was inevitable, whether the tide of faith must always drown reason's island, or whether that moment represented a choice, a turning point where civilization chose violence over wisdom and spent the next 1,000 years in darkness because of it. The marble at the Caesareum, scrubbed clean of her blood, offers no answer. The stars she mapped continue their precise orbits, indifferent to whether anyone understands them. The theorems she proved remain true, even if her name has been largely forgotten. Perhaps that is the final, cruelest irony. She died because she knew too much. But what she knew, mathematics, astronomy, the immutable logic of the spheres, survives her. Truth, it seems, is harder to kill than the teachers. They photograph ruins. They imagine the library. Few know that a greater tragedy than burning books occurred here, the silencing of a mind that might have illuminated centuries, dismembered in God's house for the crime of teaching men to think. The question remains, was she the last light of the ancient world, or could she have been the first of something new? We will never know. The tiles saw to that.